لماذا لا يلزم القانون الدولي إسرائيل؟
You put Israel in a special cupboard and you say do not touch.
هل كنت تستخدم مثلا اسم مستعار؟
When I was in Russia there was still a telex machine in the toilet.
أنت توقعت هذا الشيء قبل أن يحدث.
Why am I here? Who lost Russia?
عمل ماكينة الإعلام الغربي.
Israeli troops, snipers aim at journalists to kill them. Tracer fires coming right across my legs. And obviously I don't have to remind you of Shirin Abu Akleh. Who are Israel's two greatest enemies?
يهودي ولكن لا يدعم ما يحدث في فلسطين.
I'm outside the system.
أنت يهودي وتنحدر من عائلة يهودية.
Where would you put a Palestinian state? Where? In the Negev? Where would you put it? This is madness. Which is Palestine?
ضيفنا لهذه الحلقة يهودي من أب وأم يهوديان، يعرف أسرار مجموعات الضغط الإسرائيلية من داخل المطبخ الإعلامي والسياسي البريطاني والغربي في سنوات الحروب ضد الفلسطينيين. هو إعلامي مخضرم، أجرى أهم مقابلة مع الحارس الشخصي للرئيس الروسي بوريس يلتسن في قمة صراعات عمل المخابرات والتخابر. كيف كان يرسل تقاريره السرية من مكان مراقب، كيف مات ثم بعث من جديد. ضيفنا يكشف ويحلل ويصرح، وللتفاصيل بقية من قصة انهيار الاتحاد السوفيتي إلى أحداث 11 من سبتمبر وانتشار الإسلاموفوبيا وصولا لغزو العراق وسقوط القذافي وكل الهزات التي عاشتها الأمة العربية. ضيفي لهذه الحلقة في مسارات هو الإعلامي ديفيد هيرست. أهلا وسهلا بك مستر ديفيد في هذه الحلقة من حلقات مسارات. طبعا من الصعب جدا في مثل هذه البرامج أن يكون ضيفك أيضا صحفي ميداني وخبير في مجال الإعلام، ولكن لعلنا نبدأ أول المداخلة بماذا يعرف ديفيد هيرست نفسه؟
Well, I am the founder or co-founder and editor of Middle East Eye, which is a London-based website and about the Middle East, which is published in English and French. Before that, I was a foreign leader writer for the Guardian and a foreign correspondent. So I'm a journalist and an editor.
إذن قبل أن ندخل في التفاصيل هذه جميعها، هيرست بدأ حياته المهنية كمتدرب، ثم مراسل تعليمي لسكوتسمان، ثم تحول إلى شخصية إعلامية مشهورة في عالم استقصاء صحفي، عالم الحوارات، عالم اللقاءات الخاصة، تغطيات الحصرية لأحداث الكبرى، حروب وغيرها. من صنع هيرست أو ما الذي صنع هيرست في هذا المجال الصعب الذي سنتحدث عن تفاصيله في هذا البودكاست؟
Well, whoever made me very slowly. I started out very, very naive, knowing very little, but I had a very, very good training away from London, in Edinburgh, in the Scotsman. I think what the Scotsman gave me, in particular, was a sense of seeing what the UK was like from its Celtic fringe. From the outside, I always had that sense, and when I became a correspondent in Northern Ireland, that continued. I was always looking at London, but not from the Londoners' point of view, and not from the British establishment, but from the outside, and from people who had a very different view of what was going on. Scotland had its own education system, it had its own legal system, it shared the same royal family, but it was very independent. And the union between England and Scotland was always under discussion, particularly at a time of devolution. So I had a very strong sense of looking at Britain from the outside. And that only increased when I started writing about the Middle East.
مستر ديفيد، تقول أنك بدأت عملك ببطء شديد وبعدم حرفية. إذن ما هو العمل الذي قمت به في ميدان العمل الذي غير مسار ديفيد وأصبح انطلاقة حقيقية في مجالك الإعلامي؟
I think gradually the experience of covering quite big stories helped. In some ways, it's just luck. I happened to be down at Brighton, the Tory party conference, when there was an IRA bomb against Margaret Thatcher and blew up half her cabinet. I just happened to be there at the time covering. I was in Northern Ireland in a very tumultuous time with bombs going off all over the place. But there was one thing happening in Northern Ireland which is very important for the Middle East, and that was that both sides had realised that they couldn't win militarily. They tried everything against each other, particularly the British against the IRA. And the IRA had tried the same thing against the British. But both sides in the end were just at the beginning of the process of realising that serious negotiations had to take place on a political programme. They weren't trying to destroy each other, or the Brits would stop trying to destroy the IRA. And they were secretly, because they said they wouldn't ever negotiate with terrorists, but they were negotiating with the IRA. And that was a very interesting lesson for me, which unfortunately Israel is very far behind right now. But the path to ending a very bitter and deep conflict, like the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which is still rumbling on, by the way, comes through negotiation and comes through not trying to crush the other side, either socially or economically or militarily, but to take part, not all of it, part of their political agenda and do a deal. It's politics that ends conflict, not military force.
سنأتي إلى كل هذه التفاصيل وجهة النظر مستر ديفيد، ولكن قبل أن نغوص في مساراتنا أكثر، ما هو أكبر تحدي واجهك في أول عمل قمت به واعتبرته إنجاز يضاف إلى رصيدك كصحفي؟
I can't really answer that question because there were lots of different episodes. I then found myself at the very start, after Ireland, at the war in Yugoslavia. Mm-hmm. And I experienced the real bitterness of what is a civil war, particularly in a battle around the town of Vukovar, which was a very bloody one. And I heard, for instance, the Serb and the Croat tank crew swearing at each other from opposite sides of the same village. Mm-hmm. They're both speaking the same language, and they were absolutely at each other's throats. And I asked the people I was with, what was this all about? Why the war? Why you were part of the same village, and the village was literally, was there discrimination? No. Was there a history of domination of one side versus the other? No. So where did this bitterness come from? It was a shock. The answers they gave me, which were from history and deep inside them, were very intensely felt, but I couldn't understand it. And I could then understand the intensity of a civil war. That helped. From there, I went to Moscow, firstly as a second in command and then as the bureau chief.
آسف مستر ديفيد، لكن قبل أن ننتقل إلى موسكو نبقى في يوغوسلافيا السابقة. ما الذي جعلك يعني تنتبه أو أن ما كان يحدث وقتها من إرهاصات أولى هي ملامح تفكك في هذه المنطقة؟ أنت توقعت هذا الشيء قبل أن يحدث؟
It was the fact that absolutely all sides in this conflict wanted it, particularly the Serbs. And Yugoslavia was equally divided. It had a very strong Bosnian Muslim population. I went to Sarajevo before it exploded, and you could just feel in the air that something very big was about to happen. But this was before some of the worst clashes in Sarajevo. I went there first. And I basically covered part of the war of the Serbo-Croat war, because, it started in Slovenia first, Then it went down towards Croatia. And at that time, you could cross quite freely between the two lines. In fact, I walked straight through one of the lines just before shooting was happening. I astonished the front line by literally walking straight through it. And it was both a fascinating time for me, but also probably one of the most dangerous, because it was at that time, before the front lines were established, that reporters were being shot, or they walked straight into an ambush. Luckily, I have 9 lives, and I certainly spent one of them there.
يعني يحب الإنسان الحياة مستر ديفيد، وأنت تواجه الموت دائما في مثل هذه الأعمال. يعني هل في مثل هذه الأزمات كان بينك وبين الموت ربما خطوة؟ يعني مثل معركة فوكوفار مثال.
Not in Vukovar. I came very, very close to death in Grozny in Chechnya. When I was a correspondent in Moscow. I've never considered myself a war correspondent. I'm a sort of accidental war correspondent. I happened to be around at the time, and I don't really like covering wars. They all have the same smell of death. They have the most appalling suffering, and which you can see in front of your eyes, and the loss, and also the most appalling heroism. There are extremes, and most wars take a long time to get going, and you have long periods of boredom and a few seconds of sheer terrifying horror. And in those moments of real danger, you ask yourself, what am I doing here? I had, in Moscow, I had a young family of twins and an elder daughter. And I asked myself, what on earth am I doing with bullets literally going all around me and mortar bombs exploding around me? And you couldn't answer that question, honestly, because I actually shouldn't have been there. I should have been back with my family.
ما الذي يتوجب على المراسل الصحفي سيد ديفيد خلال تغطية الحروب لخلق نستطيع أن نقول توازن صعب في المهمة الصحفية، وكذلك بين البحث عن الأمان كي ينجو ويتابع مسيرته الوظيفية ويعود أيضا إلى عائلته؟
It's an extremely good question, and I can't really answer it properly. There are some excellent and brave war reporters, particularly women. Women are better than men at war reporting, in my view. But there are exceptional...
لماذا هذا
and also,
الأفضلية؟
I would like to make another point here, and that is that, Westerners, white Westerners like me, regard themselves as, the great heroes that drive in and whatever. What I learned was that it's the fixers, it's the local journalists on the ground who are the real heroes. It's not the Western reporters like me who come in with camera crews and then go away again. It's the people who report a war and live in it that makes the difference. They are the real heroes. They are the ones who we should concentrate on. They are the ones in Gaza at the moment, not me. It's easy for me to be here in Doha saying Gaza's terrible. We've lost contact with 2 correspondents in Gaza who've had to move 3-4 times. They're the heroes, not me.
دعنا نتحدث عن غزة، يعني ربما نغير مسارنا ونتحدث عن غزة بما أنك فتحت هذا المسار لنا. ما هو وصفك؟
There's one thing I'd like to say about
تفضل.
Moscow. Okay, I was in Moscow at a very, very critical time. I arrived at the very last months of the Soviet Union, and I saw the flag coming down on the Supreme Soviet in December 1991. I was there just before. My family came in May 92, and we stayed till 1997. So it's a very interesting period. It was the first experiment of post-Soviet Russia with democracy. But it was a very, very brief experiment. And it soon deteriorated. Now, at that time, when I was there, I struggled to find communists. I'm being quite serious with you. I was really interested in saying, is there anyone here who believes in a dictatorship of the proletariat? Mm-hmm. No one. They believed in McDonald's, they believed in capitalism, they believed in Western labels. They looked at what you wore. They were complete converts to capitalism. Cringingly, I thought, oh no, this is going to end in disaster. This is not going to... And the one thing I pride myself in Moscow was saying that it would end in disaster. Everyone in the Western media said that what Yeltsin was doing was brilliant, that Moscow was ours, we owned it. And it went all the way up to 1997 when the Washington Post had that famous headline, "Who lost Russia?" The answer was they never owned it. Mm. And America and Britain and West tried in Russia to do exactly what they did later in Iraq. And
أنا
they
آسف
failed.
سيد ديفيد، سنعود إلى مسار موسكو، ولكن أنت فتحت لنا باب غزة وحماية الصحفيين في الأزمات. ما هو وصفك للحرب الإسرائيلية على غزة الآن؟ سقط فيها عدد كبير من الصحفيين سواء من الداخل الفلسطيني أو من الخارج، رغم حماية القانون لحرية الصحافة الملزمة التي تحمي الصحفيين في مثل هذه الحروب والأزمات.
Forgive me for being cynical, but I don't believe that international law exists. Mm-hmm. In the sense that the police exist in Doha. If you do something wrong, someone will say, come with you, they'll put their hand in you. There is no such thing in international law. Certainly there is the theory that journalists should not be touched. But time and time again, we have seen Israeli troops, snipers, aim at journalists to kill them, knowing what they're doing. And obviously I don't have to remind you of Shireen Abu Akleh. Mm-hmm. And many, many people like her. Mm-hmm. So it's not an accident they're being bombed. And I think Benny Gantz actually said, the so-called moderate voice in Israel, but he's not at all moderate by our standards. He said something very interesting. He said that if Western journalists entered Gaza and started telling the truth would not be good for Israel. Never a truer word said.
سيد ديفيد، لماذا لا يلزم القانون الدولي إسرائيل؟ أو لماذا لا تلتزم إسرائيل بهذا القانون؟ هل هناك حماية نوعا ما لإسرائيل من هذا القانون؟ أم أنها فوق القانون في ذلك؟
It's above the law and it's in a place in the international community, certainly in the Western, not outside the West. You put Israel in a special cupboard and you say, do not touch. It's got nuclear weapons, but it's not part of the NPT. Everyone knows that. It's got an army that shoots to kill. There are no rules of engagement. Everyone knows that. But it's not part of the International Criminal Court or international war crimes investigations. It has always been, since its inception, right from 1948, it says it's a part of the West with Western values. Biden said if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. It's a European implant. It's a colony. And it's always been treated specially from any other country. Now what we're seeing is that going to obscene degrees. But the principle of exceptionalism for Israel has been there all along.
سيد ديفيد، في بداية الحديث أحسست بأنك كنت متحمس كثيرا للحديث عن موسكو، وكانت ربما تجربة فريدة في حياة ديفيد هيرست. أنت يعني ربما غطيت أغلب ما حدث، ولكن هناك حدث مميز وهو حرائق الغابات، يعني التي أشعلت شرارة انهيار الاتحاد السوفيتي. وخاصة في الحرب الأولى في الشيشان كما نعلم. يعني إعادة انتخابات ويرس ينسن، هناك انحدار أخلاقي وانحدار جسدي هناك. هل تم اختيارك لهذه المهمة أم أنك أنت اخترت أن تخوض هذا التحدي الصعب؟
It was my decision. I was lucky to be there at such an interesting time. I think it was a very unique experience for me.
محظوظ رغم وجود الموت في كل مكان.
Yeah. How can I put it? You were aware that history was being made, and as a journalist, you know, those are the moments that make your career. So what happened? What was the history being made? The history being made was the very brief, I would say, flirtation with democracy, the realization that the state was starting to collapse, and then the retrenchment into nationalism. Now, we didn't know about Putin then. I'd never heard of him. He was not a particularly interesting figure in the KGB. He'd been not in a particularly important part of the Warsaw Pact when he was there. At the time he worked in the KGB, he was in Berlin. He was in East Germany, and that wasn't terribly important to the Soviet Union at the time. All the main KGB operatives were working in Afghanistan, for instance. That's where the cream of the KGB was. They didn't really need to concern themselves with East Germany, which was quite a successful model, quite rich by their standards. Putin then ended up as a deputy to Anatoly Sobchak, who was one of the leading radical shock therapy economists, i.e. Putin emerged not from the opposition, not from the communists or the Red Directors. He emerged from the bowels of the family, the corrupt family around Yeltsin, the mafia state. And I realized that something very important was happening. I didn't meet ever Putin then. I've met him quite frequently since, but not then. I interviewed Yeltsin's personal bodyguard called Alexander Korzhakov. And he was very interesting. Because he told me about Yeltsin's deepest personal secrets. He revealed to me that Yeltsin was a depressive and tried to commit suicide at one point by locking himself in the sauna. You know, Russia was wild at those times. It really was interesting to be there. All the discipline of the communist state had collapsed. And what you got was this sort of real Russian indiscipline. And it was like, they called it Diki Kapitalism. In Russian, it means wild capitalism. And that was it. It was like the Wild West. It was like Chicago in the 1920s. Everything was going on. There were mafia groups being set up. No one really trusted the state. If there was a car crash on the streets, people just step over the bodies. There was no real ambulance service. There was no banking system. I had to carry cash with me everywhere. It really was quite wild. And most of the state structures had disappeared. Now, the real mistake of the West was to help this disintegration happening. They speeded the disintegration of Russia in the same way that they wanted to destroy the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. Actually the same thing. They actually believed that you had to destroy a state before rebuilding it in your image. And that was a terrible thing to do to Russia, because what that was stimulating was, if you can imagine yourself to be a Russian, you say, Gorbachev and Yeltsin are traitors. And that is what Korzhakov said. So Korzhakov was telling me about the reaction that would happen to this very sort of primitive Western reaction to Russia, only it would happen in a decade's time. And he was dead right. And he was telling me the position that Putin would adopt many years later. And that was interesting. And the other thing I realized was that the quicker NATO expanded eastwards, the more Russia would feel threatened. So even though I went all the way around Ukraine, Ukraine was peaceful. When I was there, Ukraine was actually peaceful. What was happening was the bushfire wars all around Ukraine, to the north, to the south. There was a place called Transnistria. There was a big punch up there. I also went to the Caucasus where this happened, and I saw the so-called terribly well organized Russian army being fought to a standstill by one or two Chechen fighters who dodged between one window and another in a hostage situation called Budyonovsk. And I could see how badly the Russians were fighting and how well the Chechen fighters could fight. So that was a big experience for me. It was the first Chechen war, and the Chechens won that war. They were crushed by Putin in 2000. That's a different story, but they won that war. And you could see there were various strands of the Chechen resistance. One was a nationalist strand, and they were killed. And the other was the beginnings of Al-Qaeda. And you could see a split in the Chechen opposition. There was one experience I had in Chechnya, in a place called Piavomayskaya. It's a village, and I was, and you could move freely between the Russian lines and the Chechen lines. You could just literally drive through them or get a taxi through them. Just interviewed a school, a primary school, that had been attacked by a Russian helicopter. And we were coming out of the school, and I said, "Where did the attack come from?" And the primary school teacher said, "From that helicopter in the next field." And as she was saying that, the helicopter had finished its lunch break, went up into the air, turned around, looked at me, and fired a missile at me. Happily, the missile was obviously manufactured on a Friday afternoon when the Russians were thinking of their weekend in their dacha, and it landed 2 meters away from me and just fizzled, didn't explode.
Oba.
And then I started running very quickly, and the whole front line had started, and there were Chechen fighters behind me getting out of their buses with their green bands, and they were saying Allahu Akbar, and they were running towards the Russian lines. And then there were tracer fires coming right across my legs, and then a cow next to me exploded, and then there was a villager next to me there was a tank coming towards us, a Russian tank. I mean, I suddenly found myself in the middle of a battle, basically. And I said, "What are you going to do with that tank?" And he said, "I'm going to roll this tire in front of the tank and throw this petrol bomb at it." And I said, "Good luck to you," right? And then I ran more, and I got out of it. By running, and it was fire all over the place. When I'd finished that was the closest time I'd actually come to. I said, what am I here? Why am I here? What is this about? Why have I got, a young wife, twins aged 2, and Catherine aged 3 in Moscow, and what am I doing here? And on the one hand, I felt proud of what I did in Chechnya, along with many other reporters. And on the other hand, I said, this is madness. If that missile had exploded, I wouldn't be here. And that would be it. Gone. So that's what a foreign reporter's like. I mean, that's the reality. There's stupidity, there's luck. Sometimes the luck runs out, sometimes not. That was another of my second lives that had very quickly disappeared.
سنقف في مساراتنا عند الحيوات التي ذكرتها في بداية المسارات، لأنك ذكرت أن هناك أكثر من حياة ربما منحت لك أو أعطيتها فرصة أخرى لتستمر في هذا العمل، ربما لتوصيل مثل هذه الرسائل. ولكن سيد ديفيد، استوقفني يعني لقائك الحصري مع الحارس الشخصي ألكسندر، مع بوريس يلسن رئيس يلسن. هذا اللقاء كان مميز وكان محط أنظار العالم، وربما كان يعني هذا اللقاء محطة انطلاق قوية في مسيرتك المهنية. كيف نجحت في تنسيق هذا اللقاء الصعب؟ هناك سر، وكصحفي هل هناك يعني تنازلات قد يقوم بها الصحفي لوصول مثل هذه المقابلات، مثل تعبر مخاطر معينة، ربما تسأل عن معلومة قد رأيتها، ربما يعني هل هذه اللقاءات يعني كيف تجري يعني من داخل المطبخ الصحفي؟
Okay. So this was a very special set of circumstances. As I've described to you, Russia was much more of a freewheeling, chaotic place. It had yet to have strong institutions again. And it was very simple. I was one of the very few Western correspondents that was really critical of Yeltsin. Everyone else loved him, called him a Democrat. I didn't. I always felt that he was more of an opportunist. I liked Gorbachev, but I liked Yeltsin much less. I thought Gorbachev was an honorable man. I thought he was a failure, but he was an honorable man. But Yeltsin not. And it was Korzhikov who chose me, not the other way around. He was just interested in finding out, in meeting me, because I'd been so critical of Yeltsin. I was the only there was a Spanish correspondent as well. But all the other correspondents believed that Yeltsin was marvelous, that capitalism was here to stay, and that Russia was now part of the West. And I said, no, watch it, be careful. Mm-hmm. And I'm pleased I made that judgment. But those are the judgments I'm pleased about. I'm not pleased about covering Chechnya or individual things. But long-term judgment, I am pleased about. And that was one of them that was right. Because it's sometimes saying something that all your colleagues disagree with is a very lonely place. And you've got to have faith in yourself that your judgment is right. Even when everyone around you is saying something else, you've got to be absolutely clear with yourself that you are prepared to step out on your own and say something that is deeply unpopular for your domestic audience. And in Russia, I did that. Mm-hmm. And I'm proud of that. That's what I'm proud of. I'm not proud of being, describing dead bodies. I mean, that's not my thing. I'm proud of that particular judgment in particular. And the interview with Korzhikov was very interesting. He wanted me to write a book for him. That was his motivation. I said, no, I can't do that. I'm not doing that. Mm-hmm. But the interview went on. It was always quite hostile. It was he wasn't remotely friendly, but he was very revealing. And he's revealing about the personality of Yeltsin himself, but he was more interesting about the off-the-record stuff. I mean, as a journalist, as you know, you get two sorts of information. You get the statements that are made in front of, but the much more interesting stuff is if they trust you, they say, right, off the record, this is what's really happening. And that's when you learn stuff. You can't quote it directly, but that's the real stuff that they're trying to tell you. And people do open up. And after an hour or so, I won his confidence and he did start opening up. Mm-hmm. And that was interesting. And that was telling me that basically Korzhikov was telling me this will end badly. And he was right. But that was off the record. Mm-hmm. Even when Putin turned up, right? Putin was very pro-Western. And remember, he went yachting with the Bush father and the son. And he was absolutely in favor of the West. Mm-hmm. It took from 2000 to 2007 in his famous Munich speech to really become disenchanted with the West. And the Russian problem with the West was very simple. It was, you tell us to be a democracy, but in fact, you're rigging the rules of the game for yourself. And what's good for you is bad for Russia. What is good for Russia is a strong army, a strong state. And what's good for you is a disintegrating Russia. And that is very, very much part of the Russian national psyche and very much part of Putinism now. Now then, the big difference between Yeltsin and Putin now is that Yeltsin, they didn't have oil. Mm-hmm. And they didn't have, so it was absolutely on its knees economically, right? Mm-hmm. Which, of course, the West minimized. They said, oh, no, everything's going right, everything's fine or whatever. But there were, people queuing up for bread. Mm. It was a really poor time. Now Russia's got, and they didn't get a cent of money from the West. All they got was advice, but no money. There was nothing like the money that the West poured into Poland arrived in Russia. Now that Russia's got its own money and its nationalism, it's acting accordingly. So I completely understand why Russia is acting the way it is. I don't apologize for it. I'm not a Putin apologist because I think he's an oligarch. But I can understand the reasons for this highly aggressive Russian nationalism that we're seeing now. It wasn't inevitable. If the West had acted differently and been a bit more intelligent about what they were doing and stopped thinking in terms of a zero-sum game, we wouldn't be in the situation with Russia that we are. And I could see that happening. So my pride about the 7 years I spent in Russia was that I think I got that right. Mm-hmm. That's the only thing. It's the principle of the matter. It's not wars that matter.
سيد ديفيد، أنت حذرت من توسع الناتو مرارا، من التوسع في الشرق مرارا. لماذا أصررت على هذا التحذير؟ هل كنت ترى شيء معين في الأفق؟ لديك معلومة في هذا الخصوص مثلا؟
No, not concrete information, but the trend was going against the West. And the Russian expectations at the beginning of the 90s were so high. They really did think the streets would be paved in gold. That the letdown at the end of the 90s was very, very quick. So you had a culture of throwing the windows open to the West so that everything could come in, literally everything. Yeltsin gave the latest tank design to the Americans. I mean, could you imagine any country doing that? They gave the wiring plan of the American embassy, an annex to the American embassy, to the Americans. There were no Russian secrets that were not prepared to be given to the Americans or to the West. Everything that wasn't literally bolted down to the floor was sold. Mm-hmm. So you had the loss of all discipline, and everything was up for grabs, and it was a wild marketplace. It was inevitable that at some point, I didn't know when, but at some point, suddenly the windows would shut again, and everything would go back to what it is today. And the FSB would be back, and the microphones would be turned on again. I renovated my flat in Russia. And the first thing we saw when we ripped apart all the walls was all the wiring. Because this was a special flat given to foreigners at the Upadeka. And we could see where the microphones were. They ran into the bath. They ran upstairs where all the tape machines were. And it was regarded as a joke, right? The whole thing was a joke. It was all the past. It was all the common. Now all those microphones are back, and it's not a joke.
سيد ديفيد، لعلنا بهذا السؤال نغلق مسارنا في روسيا وننتقل إلى مسار آخر. من أطلق مسمى حروب حرائق الغابات؟ لماذا اختير هذا الاسم بالذات؟
Bushfire wars, as they were known, was the result of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, but in areas where there were still real ethnic tensions between Russian speakers and, let's say, the Chechens. That was one of them. In Georgia, that was another bushfire war between different groups. In Abkhazia, in Transnistria, all of these were wars that blew up. It was a name given by, I think, the Americans, bushfire wars. And it was a result of Yeltsin saying, you can have take as much power as you want. That was originally what he said to Chechens, and they did. And then there was a war. But there was absolutely, when I was in Russia, right at the beginning, there was no intention of Moscow of keeping Ukraine to itself. None at all. And so much so that when the border was first established between Russia and Ukraine, at least half the country in eastern Ukraine said, what the hell are we doing, putting a border with the country that we're the same country? That's what people in Kharkiv, that's what people in Transnistria, that's what some people in Kiev were saying. It was a mixture. It was a very delicate mixture. And there was no feeling of hostility between one side and another, or very little. There was a sense of disintegration. The nationalists were in Western Ukraine, and there the situation was quite different for very different reasons, for reasons of history. And we could go into that if you like, but Western Ukraine was very different. My family comes from Western Ukraine, actually, but that is a different story from a different time. At that time, there was a peaceful coexistence. There were tensions between the Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers, and there were flags, but there were no bullets. That all came much, much later. And Ukraine was a delicate balance. But other places were real wars. Chechnya was a real war of independence, which they won at first and then got crushed by the Russians. Georgia, there was a civil war in Georgia. And a lot of it was tensions between Georgians and the powers that the Russians had left behind, and who were there now stuck. There were a lot of tension in the Baltic between the Russian communities and the Balts themselves, between the Latvians and the Lithuanians and whatever. So what was left, what was meant by the bushfire wars, was a series of really big social tensions, which were a result of ethnography, of group identity. There are groups that were fighting each other.
سيد ديفيد، قبل أن نعود إلى لندن وتجربتك في الجارديان، في تلك الفترة بالذات كل الملفات كانت معقدة متداخلة. كيف كنت ترسل تقاريرك الصحفية بالوقت المناسب، السرعة المناسب، والسرية أيضا المناسبة؟ يعني الوقت كان يختلف عن هذا الوقت. هل كنت تستخدم مثلا اسم مستعار؟ هل كنت تستخدم طرق خاصة كما تستخدم بعض وسائل الاستخبارات؟ لأن هذه المعلومة التي ترسلها أو تحملها خطرة، حتى ربما تكون تستخدم ضدك من بعض الأطراف.
Yes, well, technology was completely different. When I was in Russia, there was still a telex machine in the toilet. The computers were very, very primitive. They were Tandis. The internet hadn't really got going. And we sent our copy back. But when we were, for instance, on the road, we had to literally pick up a phone and dictate the copy to a copy taker. So it was a very, very different time. And there's a curious thing about journalism. The quality of the journalism depends on shoe leather. It depends on you tramping down, knocking at a door and talking to people, right? It doesn't depend on the means of transition. And the easier the means of transition gets, the fact that everyone's now got a laptop, anyone can be a journalist, anyone with an iPhone can be a cameraman, right? But is the quality of information you're getting, it's faster, but is it better? And I don't think it is. And I actually think that journalism depends on journalists spending time and finding out about the country that they are in and really talking to people. It does not depend on standing up in front of a camera, reading a script that's been written in New York or London, which is what the American networks do. So I'm very old-fashioned. I'm not impressed by laptops, by the internet. Of course, it is our lifeblood. Of course, I've got the latest gear. I've got an iPhone. I'm not some grey old man who says it was better in my day. Of course not. But you've got to put time in to understand who you're talking with and sit down and talk. And that's journalism. It's not looking at the wires or looking at the latest take. And so the other thing is, forgive me, but I don't believe in progress. I think sometimes we go backwards.
أنا أيضا لا أؤمن بهذا معك. أنا في فريقك أيضا. سيد ديفيد، يعني عدت إلى لندن أو بعد عودتك إلى لندن انضممت إلى المكتب الخارجي صحيفة الجارديانز. قمت بتغطية أحداث كبرى عدة. 11 سبتمبر هذا مثال، غزو العراق مثال آخر، الإطاحة بالقذافي، اندلاع الحرب في سوريا. قمت أيضا بتغطية الانتفاضة الثانية في فلسطين المحتلة. دعنا نبدأ ربما من هنا. نحن نعلم جيدا ونعرف أن على مدار التاريخ الموقف البريطاني المنحاز لإسرائيل سياسيا وإعلاميا وعلى حساب الفلسطينيين. ما هي المحاذير أو نستطيع أن نقول ما هي الخطوط التحريرية العريضة التي وضعت أمام ديفيد هيرست عند تحرير أحداث وأخبار الانتفاضة الثانية في فلسطين؟
There were no guidelines as such, nothing written, but there were understandings. And actually, the Guardian reported the Second Intifada quite well. There were huge protests. We had delegations coming in saying you're biased, you can't give equal weight to the Palestinian suffering. But we had two excellent correspondents who won awards, and they were very, very tough. We had one correspondent who was a lady who's Jewish, who could speak Hebrew perfectly, Suzanne Goldenberg, and she's really tough, a great reporter. And she reported exactly what she saw, on both sides. And of course, Israel didn't like that, but they couldn't do anything about it. And we had another, Chris McGreal, who still writes for The Guardian, brilliant reporter. Now, he was the first person to talk about apartheid in Israel. He'd just come from South Africa. He was a brilliant African correspondent. And he said, look, something reminds me about apartheid in this place. The roads, the checkpoints, the settlers. I don't want. And he really investigated this and produced 2 long essays, right? Now, for his pains, he got something like, I can't remember the exact number, but something between 200 and 300 complaints, all of which went to the press council, and every complaint he won. He was a brilliant reporter. He was like a Rottweiler with the facts. If he got his claws into you, he wouldn't let go. And he was a brilliant, brilliant reporter, still is. And the difference in those days was we had an editor in Alan Rusbridger who was determined to keep The Guardian free. And he repulsed all the complaints that we were getting from Israeli supporters. Alas, now there's a different editor on The Guardian who is enormously susceptible to those lobby groups, and the Guardian's coverage has collapsed as a result. So I was lucky to be an editor in the Guardian under an editor who really didn't give a damn what people thought and who was independent. And it's the boss who's independent that matters to you. It's not what I do, it's what he does. And so we had a freedom that I don't think the Guardian has now.
سنتحدث عن جماعة الضغط واللوبيات لاحقا، ولكن لعلنا نبدأ بسؤال العام. سيد ديفيد، كيف تعمل ماكينة الإعلام البريطاني، وكيف نفهم عمل ماكينة الإعلام الغربي مع مثل هذه القضايا والأحداث الحساسة مثل القضية الفلسطينية؟
The British press works very badly. It's got some excellent journalists that know exactly what they're doing, but they're misused, and there are very, very powerful lobby or interest groups. The press is dominated by 3 or 4 major right-wing barons, of which Murdoch was one. And they have huge political power, particularly over Number 10, particularly over Downing Street, and particularly over Labour politicians. So the first thing that Blair did when he got into power, or the first thing that Brown did, was court the Daily Mail. And a big agenda is there even before you start, particularly about the Islamic world. And one of the reasons I left The Guardian, I can tell you the exact reason I left The Guardian, but one of the general reasons I left The Guardian was because I had the opportunity of setting up a very small website with a completely new name, chosen by me, in a very crowded field that was different from what everyone else was doing, which gets its information on the ground rather than from Western diplomats, and had a completely different view of the Middle East. It was a non-Western view of the Middle East.
سنأتي لهذا لاحقا. سيد ديفيد، سيد ديفيد، على حد علمي أنت تتحدث العبرية بطلاقة، وقد زرت إسرائيل عدة مرات.
I don't speak Hebrew.
أنت لا تتكلم العبرية. أنت في قلب المطبخ الإعلامي الغربي المتقدم، وعايشت لسنوات أحداث كثيرة. هناك حقائق وتقارير تؤكد أن إسرائيل، وخاصة من خلال ما يعرف بالطابور الخامس أسينيم، وهي كلمة عبرية تعني المساعد، هو الذي يقود الإعلام الدولي ويضع الأجندة الإعلامية التي تسير عليها المنظمات، وهي تخدم مصالح إسرائيل خلال الحروب والأزمات. كيف يعني، ونتيجة لذلك يعني نجد أن مواقف الإعلام الغربي الموالي لإسرائيل والمدافع عنها مثل ما يحدث الآن في غزة. سؤالي بعد هذه المقدمة، أثناء فترة عملك في بريطانيا سيد ديفيد وأوروبا كذلك، كيف واجهت أو تعايشت مع ضغط اللوبي، إن كان بشكل مباشر أو بشكل غير مباشر؟
There are different structures. It's not one group. There are organizations that put an awful lot of money into sponsoring visits to Israel. There's an organization called BICOM that is financed by a particular individual that arranged an enormous number of visits. I went on these visits. I think there's something like 43 visits of different journalists on The Guardian just to see the Israeli point of view. And that's when I met Netanyahu for the first time, when he was out of power. And they were useful. They were journalistically useful, but they steered the journalists towards one narrative. Mm-hmm. Nothing like that happened on the other side. It did, but very, very little. You didn't get these organized visits to Palestine. There were journalists who specialized it and who realized there was a story there. But that happened accidentally. There was no organized... and Israelis did similar things for young politicians, particularly in America, but also in Britain. So they identified future journalists and they identified future... And it was very organized. And there was a lot of money behind it. They were very interested in the universities, in students. Now, you could call this grooming. But another way of doing it was... proper PR, press relations. That was one level of influence. A more insidious level of was to have some influence over the key editors. Now we can't prove this. It sounds like a conspiracy, but I know it happened, and I know it happened on the Guardian in particular. And what I'm referring to is that I once had one of the Israeli embassy press people was retiring. He invited me to the party that was thrown at the Israeli embassy, and I happened to talk to the ambassador in a sort of off-guarded moment, and I was joking with him. I said, who are Israel's two greatest enemies, right? And I was expecting him to say Hamas and Hezbollah. What he said, completely seriously, was the BBC and the Guardian. And he wasn't joking.
بالطبع. يعني سيد ديفيد، لعلي يعني أسأل هذا السؤال الذي ينتابني كصحفي وكإعلامي يجلس مع إعلامي تخصص بالحروب ويعمل بمكان فيه شفافية عالية حسب ما يبدو من ما قلت. صحيفة الجارديان كان لديها مراسلة تتكلم العبرية في وسط الصراع في فلسطين، وكانت تنقل هذه المعاناة. طيب، هناك الكثير من اليهود سواء في دول عربية أو دول أوروبية، وربما هناك إعلاميون منهم لا يدعم ما يحدث في فلسطين من الحرب على الفلسطينيين. كيف يتم التعامل معهم من قبل إسرائيل كونهم يهود أيضا ينتمون لهم بالعرق، من اللوبيات التي لها يد طولة في كل المؤسسات والمجالات القطاعات في العالم؟ يعني هل يضيق عليه مثلا؟ هل يحرم من بعض الدول الدخول؟ هل هناك تهديد له كونه يهودي ولكن لا يدعم ما يحدث في فلسطين؟
Oh, it's people like me. I'm known as a traitor.
من تقصد بشخص مثلي؟
I don't.
سيد ديفيد.
People who are Jewish. I come from a Jewish family. The truth is much more subtle. And I'm very confident about my identity, right? I've got no difficulty in talking about it. If you want, we can go into it, but both my parents were refugees from Nazi Austria. One side of the family was Zionist, but the other side was not. And that's what it was like. And my parents were very careful and accurate to describe exactly what happened to them. They didn't describe themselves as victims of the Holocaust because they got out before the Holocaust happened. They're very precise about the events of fascism and what they went through and what they didn't. I thought at first they were covering up some big trauma, but they weren't. They were just being honest. And they weren't exaggerating. And at least half the European Jews who went through that experience, who lost everything and had to resettle in Miami or in London or in New York, did not suddenly feel, oh gosh, we've got to go to Palestine and kick all the Palestinians out. They didn't. They weren't Zionists. And that's just a fact. They weren't hostile to Israel, but they weren't Zionists. And I'm not a Zionist. A long time before all of this happened. And there are lots of people like me who feel a fundamental injustice is being done, and an awful lot of American Jews who started off as Zionists and who are now not. There are people like Peter Beinart, and I take my hat off to them because they're truthful people, and they're the people who are demonstrating in New York now. So there's not some sort of Jewish monolith. What's happening is that you have a particularly unpleasant government in Israel that is laying claim to these memories that belong to everyone. It doesn't just belong to me. It belongs to everyone. It belongs to all Jews, but also other people who are victims of the Holocaust. And I have a fundamentally different view of what should have happened after the Holocaust to what Israel was happened. And as Israel has progressed and all the fig leaf of liberalism has dropped, and it's now becoming simply a Jewish minority state, one state solution, Jewish minority, apartheid, I am more and more convinced that this is a terrible tragedy, not just a tragedy, a crime. And the Palestinians are suffering something that should never, ever have happened to them. And there are many, many ingredients involved in this crime. There is Zionism and the arrival of European Jews. There is colonialism, particularly from Britain, that promised something to the Arabs and then immediately stopped it. There is America now. And we are repeating, basically, with increasing obscenity, a message and a mistake that we've made absolutely all the way since the Balfour Declaration and then since 48. Only now it's coming to a head because you now actually see the results of it. I mean, one of the most obscene things at the moment is that every political party in Europe, every government in Europe says, oh, the solution is two states. Everyone. But everyone knows that two states now is impossible. Where would you put a Palestinian state? Where? In the Negev? Where would you put it? Please tell me how you'd get rid of 700,000 settlers. And which Israeli leader would agree to getting rid of 700,000 settlers? No, they're there to stay. So it's one state and it's apartheid. But that doesn't stop the American government or the British government saying, if only the stars are in the right place, if the constellation of the heavens is right, we'll eventually get a two-state solution, knowing that year in, year out, Israel is expanding until it dominates the land from the river to the sea, which is Palestine. The whole of Israel is a settlement in that sense. So it is totally cynical to propose a solution that you know has got no chance of ever being realized. But that is the Western position. So the longer this conflict goes on, the more I'm convinced that the state of Israel eventually will disintegrate. I'm not saying all the Jews will go off to the sea or whatever, but there'll have to be a new state in which Jews and Arabs live equally as partners. That's the only way this is going to be solved. But one people having dominance over another will never, ever work. But we're a long, long way from even talking about that solution.
سيد ديفيد، يعني أنت يهودي وتنحدر من عائلة يهودية، يعني يدور سؤال في المجتمعات العربية والأوساط أيضا في المجالس، يعني أن اليهود ينقسمون فيما بينهم في موضوع القضية الفلسطينية، ولكن لا يعلم العرب أو تقريبا أغلب المتابعون لمن لا يهتم بالشأن السياسي أن هناك يعني ضغوط تمارس على من يحمل أو يقف ضد الصهاينة إن صح القول. هل هناك ضغوط تمارس على إعلاميين بمكانك، إعلامي معروف له مثلا كلمة، له عمل معين، له مواقف ضد الصهاينة، موقف صريح؟ هل هناك فيما بينكم تحدث يعني مضايقات ربما في بعض الدول، في بعض السفر، في نوع من أنواع العمل، في نوع من أنواع مثل هذه الأشياء، أو ربما محاولات استقطاب؟
I personally, I'm not being harassed, but that's because I'm outside the system. I've created my own organization. But we're a very, very small organization and we're very vulnerable. But people who work on the Guardian, people who work in the BBC, people who work in the major media organizations absolutely are vulnerable to public criticism. The BBC is terrified of being called anti-Semitic. The BBC at the moment is under huge pressure from Israel to call Hamas a terrorist organization. So if you've noticed, if you read what the BBC is doing daily and just look at it, they have resisted that pressure, which is good. But what they now say is a spokesman for Hamas, which is outlawed as a terrorist organization in a number of countries. That's what they say now. But they're not themselves calling Hamas terrorists. And that's one small example of the pressure. It's pressure on words. Very soon, Israel will get everyone in America to say they don't occupy territories, but those territories are disputed. So we'll go from occupation to dispute. You watch it happening. It's already happening by Republicans in Florida. They do it first and everyone else follows afterwards. So you notice these subtle linguistic changes are constantly pushed and pushed and pushed until you're in a place which is miles away from where you were originally. And as a journalist, you've got to resist that pressure. You've got to be honest with yourself and also honest with your bosses. Happily, I'm my own boss, so it's easier for me. If I was still working for a very big organization, I think I'd have gone mad by now.
سيد ديفيد، أنت عشت محطات وأحداث كبيرة في مسيرتك المهنية. هل زرت العراق؟
Yes.
عشت مرحلة غزو العراق وما قبل مرحلة غزو العراق. ماذا أو كيف
as an editor, I covered the invasion of Iraq as an editor. As a journalist, I was in Iraq when there was a no-fly zone in the north, and there was a big exodus of Kurds towards the mountains because they thought they would be gassed by Saddam Hussein. So when I was in Iraq, Saddam Hussein was still there. I also visited Iraq as part of, the Iraqis got journalists over, so did the Iranians. And I was in Basra when one of his sons turned up in a pink Mercedes. And I was looking at my interpreters. I'm looking at you now. The pink Mercedes was looking at the interpreter, and I just saw the fear on that interpreter's face as he realized who was watching him from behind my back. That was a tiny indication of the real fear that was around, the real oppression under Saddam Hussein.
سيد ديفيد، الموقف البريطاني كان صارم إزاء العراق وكذلك الإعلام البريطاني. نتحدث عن فترة توني بلير.
It wasn't before. And there's a really, at the time of the gassing of the Kurds and at the time of the Iran-Iraq war, which I also partly covered, Rumsfeld and the British and the Germans were helping Saddam Hussein fight the Iranians. And this was under Thatcher. And they helped, particularly the Germans. Saddam Hussein produced gas to which to gas the Iranians. So when you talk to the Iranians who remember all of this, they say, who was producing the gas that gassed us? And there are survivors from that war today who I know very well. I have a very good friend who is one of them who's fighting in the Iran-Iraq war. And it's another example of how the West completely forgets its backing for Saddam Hussein and backing for Iraq at a time when they were doing the worst possible war crimes against the Iranians and also against the Kurds. Mm-hmm. And the Iranians remember. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We forget. Mm-hmm. They remember. Mm-hmm.
طبعا. دعنا نتحدث يا ديفيد عن فترة غزو العراق. الإعلام البريطاني كيف عاش هذه الفترة؟ لأنه الموقف كان موحد والعناوين كانت ربما متشابهة حتى الجارديان.
Absolutely. In fact, the Guardian had a very weak editorial line then. It only supported the invasion of Iraq if the UN had passed a resolution in favor of it, right? But it knew in its heart of heart that both the Blair government and Colin Powell was lying. They'd invented reasons that didn't exist. And we knew that. It was obvious that something was wrong with the evidence, that there was actually no weapons of mass destruction. It wasn't a secret.
لكن لم يتم التعبير عنها.
It wasn't expressed, but we knew it. And as the story broke, the Guardian covered it very well. And we did pages and pages. But at the time it happened, at the point of invasion, the Guardian basically supported the invasion. And in the Western media, the invasion was regarded as painless because no one was killed. No British troops were killed in the invasion. Mm-hmm. It was regarded as a collapse, and it was regarded like a festival. The famous shots of the downing of Saddam Hussein's statue. And they say the Iraqis are welcoming us as liberators. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it was much, much more nuanced. And something in me that had been through the same experience in Russia thought, hang on a moment, I don't know anything about Iraq. I'm not there, but I don't think this is going to be straightforward. Mm-hmm. I knew I'd already been through this in Russia. This process of, let's destroy a nation and let's rebuild it in our image. And then the problems slowly started happening. But in the initial thing, this was kinetic force. This was shock and awe, American shock and awe. Do you remember that phrase? They were bombing Al Jazeera. Mm-hmm. And we were winning. It was only after we won that the real war started.
Mm-hmm. سيد ديفيد، أنت لك نظرة استشرافية دائما للأحداث والجيوسياسية في المنطقة كما حدث في الناتو وفي روسيا وفي العراق. لابد أن كان هناك لك نظرة عما يحدث، لأن العراق كانت حائط صد ربما بين قارتين، وربما بين أحزاب كثيرة، وربما بين سياسة دول ومطامع أيضا. هل كان يملى لكم أو يطلب منكم التركيز أو تغطية بعض الأحداث أو القصص معينة لتوجيه الرأي العام مثلا؟ Manipulation.
No. I was editing what was going on. We had some very good correspondence there. And the Guardian was, at that time, as I explained before, more freewheeling. It was more driven by its writers, less by its editors. So there wasn't some little voice in my brain saying, "Oh, you got to do this, you got to do that." It wouldn't be fair to say that. No, the feeling I expressed was just private, because I wasn't actually writing at the time; I was editing. But I knew that something was going to go wrong, and bit by bit, as an editor, you're attracted to the stories that are of more interest to you, and so we started doing the stories about the disintegration. There was a colleague of mine who worked with me in Russia, had the same view, Jonathan Steele, who did some great work in Iraq, and we published his stories as well. So we had a balanced approach to Iraq. It wasn't some little voice in the background saying, "Oh, do this or do that or do the other." That wasn't the case. No, it was just a feeling that this would go wrong.
ماذا بقي لك من الذاكرة في الجارديان أو مع الجارديان في لحظة الإطاحة بمعمر القذافي؟ ما هي الزاوية الإعلامية التي ربما أخذتموها؟
We didn't know at the time that the French were the driving force behind the toppling of Gaddafi. And Sarkozy had a very personal reason for wanting to kill Gaddafi. There was still a vagueness about the rules of engagement. The Russians supported it. From Medvedev, who was then, I think, president, he supported the invasion of Libya. He regretted it afterwards, and that's one of the reasons why Russia went into Syria, because they said we were tricked by the Americans in Libya, and we're never going to make the same mistake again. It was Libya that's responsible for the Russian intervention in Syria. Mm-hmm. And I remember a very well-funded film, which was in Russian, a very high-quality film, that was all against Medvedev. They were saying basically he was a traitor. So at the time, the French wanted to get rid of, Sarkozy in particular wanted to get rid of Gaddafi, because Sarkozy had tried to make a sexual approach to one of Sarkozy's wife. Mm-hmm. It was absolutely personal. Mm-hmm. But the British and the Americans were slightly vaguer. They said, "Oh, we want to rescue Benghazi." Mm-hmm. It was all about stopping Benghazi from being... Mm-hmm. Whether or not Benghazi was in imminent danger from the forces, I'm not sure about that. We had Chris McGreal on the ground, again, the same reporter that did that fantastic work about apartheid. He was there in Libya, and so we had good reporters.
أيضا نعود بالذاكرة بك إلى أحداث مهمة جدا 11 سبتمبر. لاحظنا هجمة شرسة سيد ديفيد على العالم الإسلامي وانتشار الإسلاموفوبيا في الإعلام وفي العالم، وتوتر شديد على مستوى العلاقات الدولية. ما هي التوجيهات التي كانت تعمل من خلالها نستطيع أن نقول الجارديان، وما هو خطها التحريري في هذه الفترة؟
I wasn't part of the editorial team at the time. I mean, I was an editor, but I wasn't in charge of setting policy. That only became later.
ما الفرق سيد ديفيد بينهما؟ لو تشرح لنا الفرق بين.
Okay, so one is a practical editor working on
المكان.
One is a practical editor working on the foreign desk, and they're basically responsible for putting the news in the newspaper or the website. Mm-hmm. The other one is actually writing the editorial line in the name of the Guardian, the leader, the editorial line, which is separate from the news gathering process. In most Western newspapers, you have a team of experts who are writing the editorial line in the name of the Guardian, which is separate from the editors writing the news.
ولكن الجميع يعني تحت مظلة خط تحريري واحد. سياسة
everyone's
واحدة.
under, but this specialized team works directly to the editor and apart from the newsroom. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So and that's that works in the Guardian, Telegraph, the BBC different, because it's a public service, but all the American newspapers. So there are two different teams of people. So at the time, I was just working on the daily news. I wasn't working on policy. And I remember the headline on the day of 9/11. And the headline was Declaration of War, which is interesting. And it was a first example of a newspaper that I'd worked for, nearly died for, being part of the whole process that the shock to America was such of 9/11 that it basically declared war on the whole world. I didn't know who to fight. It was just everyone, right? Particularly in the Middle East. Instead of making an anti-terrorist operation against Osama bin Laden, it was a war to invade Afghanistan, and then a war to invade Iraq. It's like fighting everybody. And the Guardian made the same mistake in regarding this as a war, not as a terrorist incident, because it was so shocked. And the shock to America was great. I think a similar shock has been created in Israel. We can talk about that later. In October the 7th. It's the same thing. It's the shock. It's the shock to a people and a power that is totally in control. America on the eve of 9/11 was totally in control. Communism had stopped, collapsed. Everyone was a capitalist. The Chinese were capitalists. The Russians were capitalists. They had no one challenging them. They were in charge. They were the world leader, the only world leader. Look at them now. And that's the change between the two. But there was a real shock
اسمح لي سيد ديفيد.
with those airplanes going in. Sorry.
لم تجبني على الإسلاموفوبيا. كل الإعلام الغربي من بريطانيا إلى كل الدول الغربية تتهم الإسلام صريحة بالإرهاب وأنه يغذي الإرهاب. تأثير هذا يعني على سير ما حدث بعد ما حدث من 11 سبتمبر.
Yes, that's true. And they also had in the back of their minds the idea of Huntington's clash of civilization, if you remember that theory, that there was a fundamental clash of civilizations between a superior civilization and a weaker one, an inferior one. I think in the first reaction to 9/11, Bush was conscious of making that mistake, and he visited mosques, and he went out of his way not to confuse Al-Qaeda with other with Islamism in general. Now, everything is being allied together. I mean, after 9/11, I remember the Guardian receiving a very big, during the Arab Spring, we received a very big delegation from the Muslim Brotherhood. And initially, the Guardian was very in favor of the Arab Spring. Then everything changed. And the reason I actually left the Guardian, the real reason I left the Guardian, was because I was the foreign leader writer. I was over Egypt, and it was 2013. And Morsi had been ousted in a military coup. It was very obviously a military coup. I called it a military coup on behalf of the Guardian. But all the reporters, particularly the Middle East specialists, said it's not a coup. This is a second revolution.
بتوجيه أم برأي منهم؟ ما هذا الإجماع على هذا الرأي؟
It was their opinion. It was my opinion versus them. And the editor of the time believed them, not me. So I said, خلاص, I'm going.
لا نريد أن نبقى في 11 سبتمبر سيد ديفيد، ولعلي أعطيك اقتباس لدي هنا من الجارديان أيضا في الذكرى 20 لأحداث 11 سبتمبر تقول: لا نهاية تلوح في الأفق. الصحيفة تقول أن تهديد من الإرهاب الإسلامي مستمر في الغرب. يعني شحذ الإعلام الغربي ضد الإسلام ما زال مستمرا إلى يومنا هذا، فما زلنا في نفس الدائرة. السؤال هو: هل هناك أمل أن يكون الإعلام الغربي أن يغير سياسته سيد ديفيد الهجومية ضد الإسلام، ضد الإسلام والإسلاموفوبيا وغيره؟
When was that quote written?
في الجارديان في ذكرى 20.
Yeah, but when?
في ذكرى 20 في لندن 2021 تقريبا من 3 سنوات.
Okay. 3 years ago. Okay, I'm very glad that I wasn't in the Guardian, and I didn't write that. What I'm saying is that in the initial reaction to 9/11, the Guardian didn't make that mistake, from my memory. Now, today, you're absolutely right. They're expressing something which is deeply wrong, but also something deeply ideological. In my time there, I don't think that happened. My memory is that I wouldn't have written anything like that. And in my time, I think the Guardian had a good foreign desk. It had specialists. It had Arab speakers. It had a desire to cover the Middle East from every single country. Now it is withdrawn from most of the countries. It's got a very, very limited coverage of the Middle East. Then we had a very strong foreign desk. Now it's a weak foreign desk. Things have structurally has changed in the Guardian to actually change it. But at the time I was working there, they had real specialists who would never have written something as crude as that.
سيد ديفيد، أنت كنت كاتبا رئيسيا لزعماء أجانب في الجارديانز. ما هي أبرز شخصية التقيت فيها وأجريت معها حوار، وما هو أبرز تحدي في هذه المقابلة ربما؟
I can't remember one that I did, but I did a whole series of ones about the Arab Spring that I was proud of. We had to write about different countries all the time, and I simply forgotten the events that led to it. I wrote a lot about the Middle East.
لعلنا سيد ديفيد نأتي إلى وضعك الحالي والزمن الراهن، الميدل
Okay.
أكثر الأصوات تأثيرا في الشرق الأوسط. أنت رئيس تحرير، مؤسس مشارك. لماذا اخترت هذا المشروع لتكون مؤسس مشارك فيه، ومن أوروبا الشرقية ومن العالم الغربي إلى الشرق الأوسط؟ ما الذي جعلك تختار هذه المنطقة؟
When I left the Guardian, I just thought I would retire. I was then approached by someone who said, look, we want you to start a new website. And it was a very, very big challenge. And I was intrigued by the challenge. And the challenge was to start something completely new that was independent. There was no government behind it. There was no movement behind it. I was given a bit of money, but it wasn't a huge amount of money. And the challenge was to create something out of nothing. And I just enjoyed it.
هل هذا ما يفسر لنا إصرارك على أن تكون رئيس تحرير لهذا الموقع كي تحافظ على خطوط هذه المؤسسة الإعلامية كخط تحريري؟
Curiously, I'm in an organization that wants me to stay on as editor-in-chief of Middle East Time. I'm always offering to say, look, there should be someone younger to take over. So it's the first organization I've worked for that actually wants me to keep on working for them. We have established a good working relationship with the publishers. We're all working for the same reason. Money and budgets are very, very tight with inflation. So we remain a small organization, but our influence is spreading, and I'm very proud of what Middle East Eye and my colleagues have done. We have a really good bunch of journalists, young journalists, working for us. And I think one of the secrets of success is they have a dual identity. Many of them have been brought up in the West, but they remember their families and their groups. So they're half British, half Egyptian, half British or American and Syrian. Iraqi. We've got all nationalities. Mm-hmm. And that's important to me for two reasons. One is that we're not Western journalists. Mm-hmm. We're not parachuting into a foreign land. We know the land. We're getting journalists from it. And we've won awards. We've won. Palestinian journalists working for us have won awards from small villages. I'm very proud that we've given that opportunity. We've reversed the formula of parachuting Western journalists in. And I'm really proud of that. And our journalists in Gaza have won awards as well. Everyone who works for us has a foot in both camps. Mm. And they don't need to be told to work, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on Gaza. My task is to actually stop them from working, mm-hmm. because everyone is involved in that challenge. Everyone feels it personally. They feel it with their families. Mm-hmm. So no one has to, I don't have to say, where's the next story from mm-hmm. Gaza? They give it to me, it comes flooding in. Mm-hmm. And I like working for that enthusiasm and that generosity and all the hard work that goes into our coverage of Gaza at the moment and the blogs that we produce and the rest of it. Mm-hmm. I'm very proud of it. That's, if you ask me what am I proud of most in my life, it's the blog we're producing in Gaza every day.
يعني سأبقى في نفس هذه الدائرة وفيما تفخر به سيد ديفيد، ولكن الآن أنت ذكرت نقطة في غاية الأهمية، ألا وهي أنت ما زلت محافظا على رئيس التحرير كي يبقى ما ينقل بصورة تريدون أنتم من جهة الشفافية. الآن أنا شخصيا عندما أسافر إلى أوروبا وأسافر إلى أمريكا، عندما أتحدث مع شخص تحت سن 50 لا يعرف مثل ما يعرفه شخص فوق سن 50، هناك فرق شاسع في المعلومة عن الشرق الأوسط. فكيف تستطيعون كإعلاميين مثلا، أنت ستترك رئيس التحرير في وقت ما وتسلم هذا المشعل إلى الجيل الحديث، كيف تستطيعون أن توصلوا الأفكار الصحيحة أو السليمة وجهات النظر إلى الإعلام الجديد، لأن الإعلام الجديد يتعرض إلى غسيل مخ في جميع العالم؟
Well, we have a very young staff. Some of them are just starting out in journalism, and we train them. And we're training the next generation of journalists. And I'm sure a lot of them will go on to become really important figures in journalism. So you can do it by personal example. You can do it by training. You can do it by integrating, constantly looking at yourself. I think you've got to be very self-critical and not simply sit on your laurels. So we've got to be critical of ourselves. And we are. And we really examine every day. Particularly, we are critical of ourselves and the assumptions that we make. Mm-hmm. And one of the dangers of the Gaza coverage at the moment that the Western generation that you're talking about is falling into is to not stay in touch with actually what's happening in Gaza every moment of this day, or what's going on in 48, or what's going on in the West Bank. It's blurred. It's forgotten. It's on the one hand, Netanyahu says this, on the other hand, that, right? Mm-hmm. And it's a false balance completely. And then they argue. Then what you get? The most of the coverage from the New York Times, for instance, is briefing rooms. what your briefs as a journalist, Blinken said to whoever in the Arab world, and that is the journalism, right? We're not interested in that. We're interested in what's actually going on the ground. And then talking behind the scenes to people who say what actually really happened when Biden met Netanyahu. So we have a very different approach, and it's very concrete. And the result of that is we're used as a source for other journalists, which is flattering, I suppose. But it's also a lonely place that you have. So in terms of the next generation that you were talking about, you hope that something that you do rubs off on them. Everything they do rubs off on me. I'm learning from them as well. It's not a one-way process. I'm not some great wise old man. I'm a practicing journalist, and I'm as good as my last article. I mean, it's you know what journalism is like. It's an art. You have to practice it all the time, and sometimes you get rusty. So I'm very self-critical. I don't sit and say, I've got this great career. I'm now going to lecture you about how marvelous I am. I don't believe like that. It's about doing it as well. It's about leading from the front. Editors should lead from the front. They should be able to write everything and do everything they tell their juniors to do. They should be able to do it themselves. That's the sort of leadership that we have at Middle East Eye.
سيد ديفيد، يعني هل سنرى الميدل إيست آي قريبا في شكل تلفزيوني مع تأثير الصورة ما زالت مستمرة أيضا في العالم الحديث؟
I've got no idea. We're doing very well on Instagram and Facebook. We've got a tiny studio. If I described to you how small our studio was, it's about third of the size of this room, but it's good output. We've got television shows. We've got embryonic podcast. Our social media goes everywhere. In fact, we have more followers on YouTube, I hope I'm correct in saying this, than the Independent, than some very, very established newspapers. So I'm proud of that. But we grow organically. And we've always done that. So that means slightly slow growth. I mean, we've done a lot we're nearly 10 years old.
No.
And we've done a lot in 10 years, but we grow organically. So it's not huge amounts of money that are suddenly thrown at us. Absolutely not. It's trying to do that, getting a bit more market, then getting a sponsor, then doing it, but growing organically. And in that sense, you will see the ME moving forward, but not necessarily in big steps.
نختم من حيث بدأنا. أنت بدأت متدرب، ثم شققت الطريق، نجحت بقوة. هناك مقولة شهيرة تقول: ليس بالضرورة أن يكون الإعلام الناجح هو من تعلم قواعد الصحافة في الأكاديميات والجامعات، ولكن الناجح هو من يمتلك تلك الموهبة التي يتحقق منها كل شيء. هل أنت مع هذا الرأي كونك إعلامي ميداني مخضرم؟
Yes, and luck. You need luck. And you need humility. And you need to know when you've made mistakes. And by God, have I made mistakes. And you need to be self-critical. And you need constantly to listen to people. And the most important thing for a journalist is shoe leather, is wearing out your shoes and going to meet people, not talking as a punter, but learning from people, learning from everyone. That's the art and the essence of journalism. And actually, I don't think it's ever changed. From the days in which we didn't have the internet, from the days in which we had telexes, from the days in which there were no mobile telephones. I remember when mobile phones were this big. The essence of journalism hasn't changed. And that is a mission to report and to put real energy into reporting and to not produce a report until you're absolutely certain that you've got it right. Some of the pressures on journalists today are speed. But somehow speed mitigates against understanding and quality. And what you're seeing, and some of the things that you've quoted to me, are about a total lack of understanding. Most Western journalists don't understand or have stopped bothering to understand about the Middle East. And that is their internal damnation. They should become something else. If you're a journalist and you're not bothered to understand, sell cars instead.
لا يعني الآن نحن ختمنا الحلقة، ولكن أريد منك بما أنك تكلمت عن الصحفي المخضرم، أنت تعتبر مثال لكثير من الصحفيين الميدانيين في مثل هذا الوضع. الآن غزة تتعرض لقصف، هناك كثير من الصحفيين الميدانيين سواء على أرض فلسطين أو على أرض إسرائيل أو في أراضي أخرى. ما هي الرسالة التي تحب توجيهها كونك صحفي ميداني مخضرم لنقل مثل هذه الحقائق التي يدفع لها أموال طائلة لتلوين أو تغيير الواقع؟ أنت الآن شاركت في كثير من الحروب والنزاعات وتنقل عصارة الخبرة وتقول أنا فخور بما قدمت، فليكون كل صحفي ميداني فخور بما يقدم الآن. ما هي نصيحة ديفيد هيرست له؟
Stay alive, be true to yourself, and tell the truth. And do it fearlessly. And the real heroes of journalism right now are not you and me. It's certainly not me. They are the journalists who are in Gaza and who are staying in Gaza and doing everything they can to get their reports back. I take my hat off to them. They are the people that you should ask and they should interview. It's easy for me, but for them, it's a matter of life and death. And they're still going on doing their job when it is a matter of life and death for them and their families. They are the people that we should all honor at the moment.
الإعلامي المخضرم ديفيد هيرست، رئيس التحرير والمؤسس المشارك لموقع ميدل إيست. شكرا جزيلا لك على هذا الحوار، كنت ضيفا مميزا في بودكاست مسارات. شكرا لك.
Thank you for inviting me.